Hello, hello, hello. Is anybody out there? Oh, I heard the thingy saying I'm on. Cool. You know, it's pretty telling when you have to. Ah, dang it, no GFX. I don't want GFX followers. Goodbye. Anyway, hey people, how you doing? We are doing Sherlock Holmes tonight. Let me, you know, where am I? Where am I? There I am. Cool. Poof. Speak and the wolf appears. Sometimes. I'm not really good at appearing. I'm listening into Sophie Ignatius. So, yeah, kind of lurking on Sophia's stream. Wait, hold on, hold on, hold on. Did I type it right? Ignacy, okay. I don't know why I added the A. She is reading um where's she reading? Wonderful Land of Oz, I think. Emerald City of Oz, okay. She's on Emerald City already. She's a few books ahead of me. And she's in Utensia right now, so puns abound, and it is hilarious. And it is driving Matsu crazy. You know what? I'm going to shut up, Matsu, just because. Matsu. Why is it not typing? But yeah, I do enjoy listening to them and talking to them because they're pretty cool people. Oh, I have myself muted. That is incredibly funny. I had, I had my own screen muted while I'm listening to other people. No one said I was good at logic. I'm also disguised beast. They're doing art and playing some pretty good music at the same time. So, but anyway, it is only 9:09. I'm going to go ahead and push some ads out there if I can. It may not let me. No, it says the pre-roll is off. Well, guess I won't worry about that then. But we are doing Sherlock Holmes tonight. Did have a couple more followers pop up while I was out. Hopefully my computer's not going to freeze on me because it likes doing that for some god-awful reason. Okay, let me go ahead and get... Ba-dum, 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 what? I'm going to flip over and give some people some follows just because I like giving people follows. Matsu only has 96 followers. How the hell? Okay. Yeah, okay, so I need to... I can't unmute this tab. Hate that. Because I want to know when the ads are running, but I don't want to look at that screen. Bless their beautiful heart. I'm eating a 3 or 4 day old snow cone. It's probably as close to hydration as I'm going to get during a stream. My snow cone came with a hypercolor spoon, which is just all sorts of cool. But anyway, I'm going to check a few more things real quick. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. If anyone has me on Twitter, the grilled cheese sandwich that I posted, the reason I said it was probably fairly unhealthy is because I didn't use butter. I actually used bacon grease. Very tasty, though. Glalie! Okay, catch. Great. Ball. Ouch! Anyway. Woo! Okay, I need to I guess I would need to limit the z-axis for that. That way I'm not moving in and out. Oh no. It doesn't bring me any closer. That is backwards. I mean, when I lean forward, you think it would move closer. Is there a way to invert that? Bottom, 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 bottom. Bottom, bottom. Webcam perimeter calculation mode. I don't know what any of this stuff really does. Yep, turn that off. Oh, that makes it easier. Cool, I got the glalie thingy. Okay, this makes me permanently set in spot. Cool. That's what I was wanting to fix. Okay, well, cool, cool. Cool, cool. And I need to fix myself on my other screen, so there we go. Nice, nice. I'm in the right spot for my chair. Cool. Okay, it's 9:08. Okay. Okay. She's talking about Bunbury. Such a good place to eat. Okay, we're going to switch over because I'm running late now because I'm having way too much time listening to Sophia. The Oz books are fun. I do have my own recordings of them. And she's posting her recordings on her YouTube channel as well. So if you're not here, go listen to her. She's cool too. She's a teacher. Teachers are important. Me, I'm just a wolf, bookstore owner, and storyteller. Ignore the, hunting of fairy tale monsters. Anyway, it is 9:10, so as I said, I'm late. And our first story. Hold on. Let me make sure, because okay. My fire isn't moving. Not that you can see my fire because it's behind the book. But I really don't want ads playing while I'm trying to read. And I guess I could just, do something entirely different, but ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Oh, damn. Okay. Okay. Really, I'm going to read now. Our first story, The Crooked Man. One summer night, a few months after my marriage, I was seated in my own hearth, smoking a last pipe and nodding over a novel, for my day's work had been an exhausting one. My wife had already gone upstairs, and the sound of the locking of the hall doors some time before told me that the servants had also retired. I had risen from my seat and was knocking out the ashes from my pipe when I suddenly heard a clang of the bell. I looked at the clock. It was 11:45. This could not be a visitor at so late an hour. A patient, evidently, and possibly an all-night sitting. With a wry face, I went out into the hall and opened the door. To my astonishment, it was Sherlock Holmes who stood upon my step. "Ah, Watson," he said, "I hope that I might not be too late to catch you." "My dear fellow, pray come in." You look surprised, and no wonder. Relieved, too, I fancy. You still smoke the Arcadia mixture from your bachelor days, then. There's no mistaking that fluffy ash upon your coat. It's easy to tell that you have been accustomed to our uniform, Watson. You'll never pass as a purebred civilian as long as you keep the habit of carrying your handkerchief in your sleeve. Could you put me up for tonight? With pleasure. You told me that you had a bachelor quarters for one, and I see that you have no gentleman visitor presents. Your hat stand proclaims as much. I shall be delighted if you will stay. Thank you. I'll fill in the vacant peg then. Sorry to see that you've had British workmen in the house. It is a token of evil. Not the drains, I hope. No, the gas. Ah, he has left 2 nail marks from his boot upon the linoleum where the light strikes it. No, thank you. I had some supper at Waterloo, but I'll smoke a pipe with you with pleasure. I handed him my pouch, and he seated himself opposite to me, and smoked for some time in silence. He was well aware that nothing but business of importance would have brought him to me at such an hour, so I waited patiently until he should come around to it. I've had a busy day. I see that you've been professionally rather busy just now, said he, glancing very keenly across me. Yes, I've had a busy day, I answered. It may seem very foolish to your eyes, I added, but really I don't know how you deduced it. Holmes chuckled to himself. I have the advantage of knowing your habits, my dear Watson, said he. When your round is a short one, you walk, and when it is a long one, you use the hansom. And as I perceive that your boots, although used, are by no means dirty, I cannot doubt that you are at present busy enough to justify a hansom. Excellent, I cried. Elementary, said he. It is one of those instances where the reasoner can deduce the effect which seems remarkably to his neighbor, because the latter has missed the one little point which is the basis of the deduction. The same way, the same may be said, my dear fellow, for the effect of some of the little sketches of yours, which is entirely matriculous, depending on, as it does, upon your retaining it all in your own hands of some factors, and the problem which are never imparted to the reader. Now, at present, I am in the position of these same readers, for I hold in this hand several threads of one of the strangest cases which ever perplexed a man's brain, and yet I lack one or two which are needful to complete my theory. But I'll have them, Watson. I'll have them. His eyes kindled, and a slight flush sprang into his thin cheeks. For an instant the veil had lifted upon his keen, intense nature, but for an instant only. When I glanced again at his face, he had resumed that red Indian composure which had made so many regard him as a machine rather than a man. The problem presents features of interest, said he. I may even say exceptional features of interest. I have already looked into the matter, and have come, as I think, within sight of my solution. If you could accompany me to that last step, you might be of considerable service to me. I should be delighted. Could you go as far as Aldershot tomorrow? I have no doubt Jackson would take my practice. Very good. I want to start by the 11:10 from Waterloo. That would give me some time. Then, if you are not too sleepy, I will give you a sketch of what has happened, and what remains to be done. I was sleepy before you came. I am quite wakeful now. I will compress the story as far as may be done without omitting anything vital to the case. It is conceivable that you may even have read some account of the matter. It is the supposed murder of Colonel Berkeley of the Royal Munsters of Aldershot, which I am investigating. I've heard nothing of it. It has not excited much attention yet, except locally. The facts are only 2 days old. Briefly, they are these. The Royal Munsters is, as you know, one of the most famous Irish regiments of the British Army. It did wonders in both Crimea and in the Mutiny, and since time has distinguished itself upon every possible occupation. It was commanded up to the Monday by James Berkeley, a gallant veteran who started as a full private, was raised to commissioned rank for his bravery at the time of the Mutiny, and so lived to command a regiment in which he had once carried a musket. Colonel Berkeley had married at the time, and he was a sergeant, and his wife, whose maiden name was Miss Nancy Devoy, was the daughter of a former colour sergeant of the same corps. There was, therefore, as you can imagine, some little social friction when the young couple, for they were still young, found themselves in their new surroundings. They appear, however, to have quickly adapted themselves, and Mrs. Berkeley has always, I understand, been as popular with the ladies of the regiment as her husband was with his brother officers. I may add that she was a woman of great beauty, and that even now, when she has been married for upward to 30 years, she is still of a striking and queenly appearance. Colonel Berkeley's family life appears to have been one of uniformly happy one. Major Murphy, to whom I owe most of my facts, assures me that he was never heard of any misunderstanding between the pair. On the whole, he thinks that Berkeley's devotion to his wife was greater than his wife's to Berkeley. He was acutely uneasy if he were absent from her for more than a day. She, on the other hand, though devoted and faithful, was less obtrusively affectionate. But they were regarded in the regiment as the very model of the middle-aged couple. There was also absolutely nothing in their mutual relationships to prepare people for the tragedy which was to follow. Colonel Berkeley himself seems to have had some singular traits in his character. He was a dashing, jovial old soldier in his usual mood, but there were occasions on which he seemed to show himself capable of considerable violence and vindictiveness. This side of his nature, however, appears never to have been turned towards his wife. Another fact which had struck Major Murphy and 3 out of the 5 of the other officers with whom I conversed was a singular sort of depression which came upon him at times. As the Major expressed it, the smile had often been stuck from his mouth, as if by some invisible hand, when has been joining in the gaieties and chaff of the mess table. For days on end, when the mood was on him, he has been sunk into the deepest gloom. This and a certain tinge of superstition were the only unusual habits of his character in which his brother officers had observed. The latter peculiarly took the form of a dislike of being left alone, especially after dark. the puerile feature in the nature of which this conspicuously manly had often given rise to comment and conjecture. The first battalion of the Royal Munsters, which is the old 117th, has been stationed at Aldershot for some years. The married officers live out of the barracks, and the colonel has during all his time occupied a villa called Lachine, about half a mile from the north camp. The house stands in its way on its own grounds, but the west side of it is more than 30 yards from the high road. A coachman and 2 maids from the staff of servants, these of their master and mistress, were the sole occupants of Lachine, for the Barclays had no children, nor was it usual for them to have resident visitors. Now, for the events at Lachine between 9 and 10 on the evening of last Monday. Mrs. Barclay was, it appears, a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and had interested herself very much in the establishment of the Guild of St. George, which was formed in connection with the Watts Street Chapel for the purpose of supplying the poor and outcasts cast-off clothing. A meeting of the Guild had been held that evening at 8, and Mrs. Barclay had hurried over her dinner in order to be present at it. When leaving the house, she was heard by a coachman to make some commonplace remark to her husband, and to assure him that she would be back before very long. She then called Mrs. Morrison, a young lady who lives in the next villa, and the two went off together to the meeting. It lasted 40 minutes, and at 9:15, Mrs. Barclay returned home, having left Miss Morrison at her door as she passed. There is a room which is used in the morning room at the Lachine. This faces the road and opens by a large glass folding door onto the lawn. The lawn is 30 yards across and is only divided from the highway by a low wall with an iron rail above it. It was into this room that Mrs. Barclay went upon her return. The blinds were not down, for the room was seldom used in the evening. But Mrs. Barclay lit herself with a lamp and rang the bell, asking Jane Stewart, the housemaid, to bring her a cup of tea, which was quite contrary to her usual habits. The colonel had been sitting in the dining room, but hearing that his wife had returned, he joined her in the morning room. The coachman saw him across the hall and entered. He was never seen alive again. The tea which had been ordered was brought up by the end of 10 minutes, but the maid, as she approached the door, was surprised to hear the voices of her master and mistress in a furious altercation. She knocked without receiving any answer, and even turned the handle, but only to find that the door was locked upon the inside. Naturally, she ran down to tell the cook, and the 2 women with the coachman came up to the hall and listened to the dispute, which was still raging. They all agreed that only 2 voices were to be heard, those of Barclay and of his wife. Barclay's remarks were subdued and abrupt, so that none of them were audible to the listeners. The ladies, on the other hand, were most bitter, and when she raised her voice could be plainly heard, "You coward!" She repeated over and over again. "What can be done now? What can be done now? Give me back my life. I will never so much as breathe the same air as you again. You coward, you coward." Those were scraps of the conversation, ending in a sudden, dreadful cry of a man's voice, with a crash and a piercing scream from the woman. Convinced that some tragedy had occurred, the coachman rushed to the door and strove to force it, while scream after scream issued from within. He was unable, however, to make his way in, and the maids were too distracted with fear to be of any assistance to him. A sudden thought struck him, however, and he ran through the hall door and around the lawn, which had the long French doors open. One side of the window was open, which I understand was quite usual for the summer time, and he passed without difficulty into the room. His mistress had ceased to scream, and was stretched insensible upon the couch, while, with his feet tilted over the side of the armchair, and his head near the ground corner of a fender, was lying the unfortunate soldier, stone dead, in a pool of his own blood. Naturally, the coachman's first thought, on finding that he could do nothing for his master, was to open the door. But here an unexpected and singular difficulty presented itself. The key was not in the inner door, nor could he find it anywhere in the room. He went out again, therefore, through the window, and having obtained the help of a policeman and of a medical man, he returned. The lady against whom naturally the strongest suspicion rested was removed from her room still, in a state of insensibility. The colonel's body was then taken and placed upon the sofa, and a careful examination made of the scene of the tragedy. The injury from which the unfortunate veteran was suffering was found to be a jagged cut some 2 inches long at the back part of his head, which had evidently been caused by a violent blow from a blunt weapon. Nor was it difficult to guess that the weapon might have been. Upon the floor close to the body was lying a singular club of hard carved wood with a bone handle. The colonel possessed a varied collection of weapons brought from the different countries in which he had fought, and it is conjectured by the police that this club was among his trophies. The servants and I having seen it before, but among the numerous curiosities in the house, it is possible that it may have been overlooked. Nothing else of importance was discovered in the room by the police, save for the inexplicable fact that neither upon Mrs. Barclay's person nor upon the victim that or any part of the room was a missing key to be found. The door had eventually to be opened by a locksmith from Aldershot. That was the state of things, Watson, when upon the Tuesday morning I, at the request of Major Murphy, went down to Aldershot to supplement the efforts of the police. I think that you will acknowledge that the problem was already one of interest, but my observations soon made me realize that it is a truth much more extraordinary than one might at first sight appear. Before examining the room, I cross-questioned the servants, but only succeeded in eliciting the facts which I have already stated. One other detail of interest was remembered by Jane Stewart, the housemaid. You'll remember that on hearing the sound of the quarrel, she descended and returned with the other servants. On that first occasion, when she was alone, she says that the voices of her master and mistress were sunk so low that she could hardly hear anything, and judged by their tones rather than their words that they had fallen out. On my pressing her, however, she remembered that she heard the word David uttered twice by the lady. The point is of the utmost importance as guiding us towards the reason for the sudden quarrel. The colonel's name, as you remember, was James. There was one thing in the case which made the deepest impression upon both the servants and the police. This was the contortion of the colonel's face. It had set, accordingly to the account, into the most dreadful expression of fear and horror which human countenance is capable of assuming. More than one person fainted at the mere sight of him, so terrible was the effect. It was quite certain that he had foreseen his fate, and that it had caused him the utmost horror. This, of course, fitted in well enough with the police theory. If the colonel could have seen his wife making a murderous attack upon him, nor was the fact of the wound being on the back of his head a fatal objection to this, as he might have turned to avoid the blow. No information could be got from the lady herself, who was temporarily insane from an acute attack of brain fever. From the police, I learned that Miss Morrison, who you remember went out that evening with Mrs. Barclay, denied having any knowledge of what had caused the ill humor in which her companion had returned. Having gathered these facts, Watson, I smoked several pipes over them, trying to separate those which were crucial from others which were merely incidental. There could be no question that the distinctive and suggestive point in the case was the singular disappearance of the door key. A most careful search had failed to discover it in the room, therefore it must have been taken from it. But neither the colonel nor the colonel's wife could have taken it. That was perfectly clear. Therefore, a third person must have entered the room. And that third person could have only come through the window. It seemed to me that the careful examination of the room and of the lawn might reveal some traces of that mysterious individual. You know my methods, Watson. There was not one of them in which I did not apply to the inquiry. And it ended by discovering traces, but very different ones from those which I had expected. There had been a man in the room, and he had crossed the lawn coming from the road. I was able to obtain 5 clear impressions of his footmarks, one on the roadway itself, one at the point he had climbed the little wall, two on the lawn, and two very faint ones upon the stained boards near the window where he had entered. He had apparently rushed across the lawn, for his toe marks were much deeper than his heels. But it was not the man who surprised me. It was his companion. His companion? Holmes pulled a large sheet of tissue paper out of his pocket and carefully unfolded it upon his knee. What do you make of that? He asked. The paper was covered with the tracings of the footmarks of some small animal. It had 5 well-marked footpads, an indication of long nails, and the whole print might be as large as a dessert spoon. It's a dog, said I. Did you ever hear of a dog running up a curtain? I found distinct traces of this creature had done so. A monkey, then? It is not the print of a monkey. What can it be, then? Neither dog nor cat nor monkey nor any creature that we are familiar with. I have tried to reconstruct it from the measurements. There are 4 prints where the beast has been standing motionless. You see that it is no less than 15 inches from 4 foot to hind. And to that, the length of neck and head, and you get the creature not much than 2 feet long. Probably more if there is any tail. But now observe this other measurement. The animal has been moving, and we have the length of its stride. In each case, it is only 3 inches. You have an indication, you see, of a very long body with very short legs attached to it. It has not been considerate enough to leave behind any of its hair, but its general shape must be that as I have indicated, and it can run up a curtain, and it is carnivorous. How do you deduce that? Because it ran up the curtain. A canary's cage was hanging in the window, and its aim seems to have been to get that bird. Then, what is the beast? If I could give it a name, it might go a long way toward solving the case. On the whole, it was probably some creature of a weasel or some stoat tribe, and yet it is larger than either of these that I have seen. What does that have to do with the case? That also is still obscure. But we have learned a good deal, you perceive. We know that a man stood on the road looking at the quarrel between the Barclays. The blinds were up and the room lighted. We know also that he ran across the lawn, entered the room, accompanied by a strange animal, and that he either struck the colonel, or it is equally possible that the colonel fell down from sheer fright at the sight of it, and cut his head on the corner of the fender. Finally, we have the curious fact that the intruder carried away the key with him when he left. Your discoveries seem to have left the business more obscure than it was before, said I. Quite so. I undoubtedly showed that the affair was much deeper than it was first conjectured. I thought the matter over, and I came to the conclusion that I must approach the case from another aspect. But really, Watson, I am keeping you up, and I might just as well tell you all this on our way to Aldershot tomorrow. Thank you. You have gone rather far to stop. It is quite certain that when Miss Barclay left the house at 7:30, she was on good terms with her husband. She was never, as I think I have said, ostentatiously affectionate, but she was heard by the coachman shouting at the colonel in a friendly fashion. Now, it was equally certain that immediately on her return she had gone into the room in which she was least likely to see her husband, had flown to the tea, as an agitated woman will, and finally, on his coming to her, had broken into violent recriminations. Therefore, something had occurred between 7:30 and 9 o'clock which had completely altered her feelings towards him. But Miss Morrison had been with her during the whole of that hour and a half. It was absolutely certain, therefore, in spite of her denial, that she must know something about the matter. My first conjecture was that possibly there had been some passages between this young lady and the old soldier, which the former had now confessed to his wife. That would account for the angry return, and also for the girl's denial that anything had occurred. nor would it entirely incompatible with most of the words overheard. But there was the reference to David, and there was the known affection of the colonel for his wife to weigh against it, to say nothing of the tragic intrusion of this other man, which might, of course, be entirely disconnected with what had gone before. It was not easy to pick one's steps, but on the whole I was inclined to dismiss the idea that there had been anything between the colonel and Miss Morrison, but more than ever convinced that the young lady held the clue to what might have turned Miss Barclay to hatred of her husband. I took the obvious course, therefore, of calling upon Miss M., of explaining to her that I was perfectly certain that she held the facts in her possession, and that assuring her that her friend Mrs. Barclay might find herself on the dock upon the capital charge unless the matter were cleared up. Miss Morrison is a little ethereal slip of a girl, with timid eyes and blonde hair, but I found her by no means wanting for shrewdness and common sense. She sat thinking for some time after I had spoken, and then, turning to me with a brisk air of resolution, she broke into a remarkable statement which I will condense for your benefit. Excuse me. I promised my friend that I would say nothing of the matter, and a promise is a promise, said she. But if I can really help her when so serious a charge is laid against her, and when her own mouth, poor darling, is closed by illness, then I think I'm absolved from my promise. I will tell you exactly what happened upon Monday evening. We were returning from Watt Street's mission about 8:45. On our way we had to pass through Hudson Street, which is a very quiet thoroughfare. There's only one lamp in it, upon the left-hand side. As we approached the lamp I saw a man coming towards us with his back very bent, and something like a box slung over one of his shoulders. He appeared to be deformed, for he carried his head low, and he walked with bent knees. We were passing him when he raised his face to look at us in the circle of light thrown in the lamp, and as he did so he stopped and screamed out in a dreadful voice, "My God, it's Nancy!" Mrs. Barclay turned as white as death, and would have fallen down if the dreadful-looking creature had not caught hold of her. I was going to call the police, for she, to my surprise, spoke civilly to the fellow. "I thought you'd been dead for 30 years, Henry," she said in a shaking voice. "So I have," said he, and it was awful to hear the tones that he said it in. He had a very dark, fearsome face, and a gleam in his eyes that comes back to me in my dreams. His hair and whiskers were shot with grey, and his face was all crinkled and puckered like a withered apple. "I'll just walk a little way, dear," said Miss Barclay. "I want to have a word with this man. There is nothing to be afraid of." She tried to speak boldly, but she was still deadly pale, and could hardly get the words out of her trembling lips. I did as she asked, and they walked together for a few minutes. Then she came down the street with her eyes blazing, and I saw the crippled wretch standing in the lamp post and shaking his clenched fist in the air, as if he were mad with rage. She never said a word until we were at the door here, when she took me by the hand and begged me to tell no one of what happened. "It's an old acquaintance of mine who has come down in the world," she said. "When I promised her I would say nothing, she kissed me, and I have never seen her since. I have told you now the whole truth, and I have not withheld it from the police, because I did not realize the danger in which my dear friend stood. I know that it could only be to her advantage that everything should be known." That was a statement, Watson, and to me, as you can imagine, it was like a light on a dark night. Everything which had been disconnected before began at once to assume its true place, and I had a shadowy presentiment of the whole sequence of events. My first step, obviously, was to find the man who produced such a remarkable impression on Mrs. Barclay. If it were so in Aldershot, it should not be a very difficult matter. There are not such a very great number of civilians, and a deformed man was sure to have attracted attention. I spent the day in the search, and by evening, this very evening, Watson, I had run him down. The man's name is Henry Wood, and he lives in lodgings in the name of the same street in which the ladies met him. He has only been 5 days in the place. In the character of registration agent, I had a most interesting gossip with his landlady. The man is, by trade, a conjurer and performer, going round to the canteens after nightfall and giving little entertainment at each. He carries some creature about with him in the box, which the landlady seemed to be a considerable trepidation, for she had never seen an animal like it. He uses it in some of his tricks according to her account. So much of a woman was able to tell me, and also that was a wonderful that the man lived, seeing how twisted he was, and that he spoke in a strange tongue sometimes, and that for the last 2 nights she had heard him groaning and weeping in his bedroom. He was all right as far as money went, but his apartment he had given her looked like it was in bad flooring. She showed it to me, Watson. It was an Indian rupee. So, now, my dear fellow, you see exactly how we stand and why it is you that I want. It is perfectly plain that after the ladies parted away from this man, that he followed them at a distance, that he saw the quarrel between husband and wife through the window, and he rushed in, and that the creature which he carried in his box got loose. That is all very certain. But is he the only person in this world who can tell us exactly what happened to that room? And do you intend to ask him? Most certainly, but in the presence of a witness. And I am that witness. If you will be so good, if he can clear the matter up. Well and good. If he refuses, we have no alternative but to apply for a warrant. But how do you know he'll be there when we return? You may be sure that I took some precautions. I have one of my Baker Street boys mounting guard over him, who would like to stick him in a burr and go where he might. We shall find him in Hudson Street tomorrow, Watson, and meanwhile I should be the criminal myself if I kept you out of bed any longer. It was midday when we found ourselves at the scene of the tragedy, and under my companion's guidance we made our way at once to Hudson Street. In spite of his capacity for concealing his emotions, I could easily see that Holmes was in a state of suppressed excitement, while I was myself tingling at that half-sporting, half-intellectual pleasure which I invariably experienced when I associated myself with him in his investigations. This is the street, he said as we turned into a short thoroughfare lined with plain two-storied brick houses. Ah, here's Simpson to report. He's in all right, Mr. Holmes, cried the small street Arab, running at us. Good, Simpson, said Holmes, patting him on the head. Come along, Watson, this is the house. He sent in his card with a message that he had come to important business, and a moment later we were face to face with the man we had come to see. In spite of the warm weather, he was crouching over the fire, and the little room was like an oven. He sat all twisted and huddled in the chair, in a way which gave him an indescribable impression of deformity. But the face which he turned towards us, though worn and swarthy, must at some time have been remarkable for its beauty. He looked suspicious at us now, out of the yellow snout, bulbous eyes, and without speaking or rising, he waved towards 2 chairs. Mr. Henry Wood, of India, I believe, said Holmes affably. I've come over this little matter of Colonel Berkeley's death. What should I know about that? That's what I want to ascertain. You know, I suppose, that unless the matter is cleared up, Mrs. Berkeley, who is an old friend of yours, will, in all probability, be tried for murder. The man gave a violent start. I don't know who you are, he cried, nor how you come to know what you know, but will you swear to me that this is true that you tell me? Why, they're only waiting for her to come to her senses to arrest her. My God, are you with the police yourself? No. What business is it of yours, then? It's every man's business to see justice done. You can take my word that she's innocent. Then you're guilty? No, I'm not. Who killed Colonel James Barkley, then? It was a just providence that killed him. But mind you this, that if I had knocked his brains out, as if it was in my heart to do, he'd have had no more of this due to my hands. If his own guilty conscience had not struck him down, it is likely enough that I might have had his blood upon my soul. But you want me to tell the story. Well, I don't know why I shouldn't, for there's no cause for me to be ashamed of it. It was this way, sir. You see me now with my back like a camel and my ribs all awry. But there was a time when Corporal Henry Wood was the smartest man in the 117th foot. We were in India then, the cantonments, at a place called the Berthy. Barclay, who died the other day, was a sergeant in the same company as myself, and the belle of the regiment. Aye, and the finest girl that had ever been the breath of life between her lips was Nancy Devoy, the daughter of the corps sergeant. There were two men that loved her, and one that she loved. And you'll smile when you look at this poor thing huddled before the fire and hear me say that it was for my good looks that she loved me. Well, though I had her heart, her father was set upon her marrying Barclay. I was a harum-scarum, reckless lad, and he had an education who was already marked for the sword belt. But the girl had held true to me, and it seemed that I would have had her when the mutiny broke out, and all hell was loose in the country. We were shut up in Bertie, the regiment with us, and half a battery of artillery, a company of 6, and a whole lot of civilians and womenfolk. There were 10,000 rebels around us, and they were as keen to set the terriers around in a rat cage. About the second week of it, our water gave out, and it was a question whether we would communicate with General Neal's column, which was moving up country. It was our only chance, for we could not hope to fight our way out with all the women and children, so I volunteered to go out and to warn General Neal of our danger. My offer was accepted, and I talked it over with Sergeant Barclay, who was supposed to know the ground better than any other man, and who drew up a route by which I might get through the rebel lines. At 10 o'clock the same night I started off upon my journey. There were thousands of lives to save, but it was only one that I was thinking of when I dropped over the wall that night. My way ran up a dried-up watercourse, which we hoped would screen me from the enemy's sentries. But as I kept round the corner of it, I walked right into 6 of them, who were crouching down in the dark, waiting for me. In an instant I was stunned with the blow and bound hand and foot. But the real blow was to my heart and not to my head. For as I came to, I listened to as much as I could understand of their talk. I heard enough to tell me that my comrade, the very man who had arranged the way that I was to take, had betrayed me by means of a native servants in the hands of the enemy. Well, there's no use for me to dwell on that part of it. You know now what James Barclay was capable of. Bertie was relieved by Neil next day, but the rebels took me away with them in the retreat, and it was many a long year before I saw a white face again. I was tortured and tried to get away, and was captured and tortured again. You can see for yourselves the state in which I was left. Some of them that fled into Nepal took me with them. Then afterwards I was set up as Pastor Geeling. The old folk up there murdered the rebels who had me, and I became a slave of theirs for a time until I escaped. But instead of going south, I had to go north until I found myself among the Afghans. There I wandered for many a year, and last came back to the Punjab, where I lived mostly among the natives and picked up a living by conjuring tricks that I had learned.
What use was it to me, a wretched cripple, to go back to England and to make myself known to my old comrades? Even my wish for revenge would not make me do that. I'd had rather that Nancy and my old pal should think of Harry Wood as having died with a straight back, and see him living and crawling with a stick like a chimpanzee. They never doubted that I was dead, and it meant that they should never. I heard that Barclay had married Nancy, and that he was rising rapidly in the regiment, but even that did not make me speak. But when one gets old, one has a longing for home. For years I had dreamed about the bright green fields and hedges of England. At last I determined to see them before I died. I saved enough to bring me across, and then I came here where the soldiers are. For I know their ways and how to amuse them, and so earned enough to keep me.
Your narrative is most interesting, said Sherlock Holmes. I've already heard of your meeting with Mrs. Barclay and of your mutual recognition. You then, as I understand, followed her home and saw through the window the altercation between her husband and her, in which she doubtless cast his conduct to you with his teeth. Your own feelings overcame you, and you ran across the lawn and broke in upon them.
I did, sir, and at the sight of me he looked as if I'd never seen a man look before. He went, and over he went with his head into the fender. But he was dead before he fell. I read death on his face as plain as I read the text over the fire. The bare sight of me was like a bullet through his guilty heart.
And then?
Then Nancy fainted, and I caught up the key in the door in her hand, intending to unlock it and get help. But as I was going, it seemed to be better for me leave it alone and get away, for the next thing might look black upon me. And anyway, my secret would be out if I were taken. In my haste, I thrust the keys into my pocket and dropped my stick while I was chasing Teddy, who had run up the curtain. When I got him into his box from which he had slipped, I was off as fast as I could run.
Who's Teddy?
Asked Holmes. The man leaned over and pulled up the hutch of the corner. In an instant out slipped a reddish brown, beautiful creature, thin and lithe,
With the legs of a stoat, a long, thin nose, and a pair of the finest red eyes that I have ever seen in an animal's head.
"It's a mongoose!" I cried. "Oh, some of them call them that. Some of them call them Ichimon," said the man. "A snake catcher is what I call them, and Teddy is amazingly quick on cobras. I have one here without fangs, and Teddy catches it every night to please the folk of the canteen."
Any other points, sir?
"Well, I may have to apply to see you again.
Well, we may have to apply to see you again if Mrs. Barclay should prove to be in serious trouble.
In that case, of course, I'd come forward."
But if not, there's no objection in raking in the scandal against a dead man. Foully as he has acted, you have had at least the satisfaction of knowing that for 30 years his life his conscience bitterly reproached him for his wicked deed. Ah, there goes Major Murphy on that other side of the street. Goodbye, Wood. I want to learn if anything has happened since yesterday.
We were in time to overtake the Major, before he reached the corner.
Ah, Holmes, he said. I suppose if you heard all the fuss has come this nothing? What then? The inquest is over. The medical evidence showed the conclusion of death was due to apoplexy. You see, it was quite a simple case after all. Oh, remarkably superficial, said Holmes, smiling. Come, Watson, I don't think we shall be wanted in Aldershot any more.
"There's one more thing," said I as we walked down to the station. "If the husband's name was James and the other was Henry, what was his talk about David?"
That one word, my dear Watson, should have told me the whole story.
had I been the ideal reasoner by which you are fond of depicting. It was evidently a term of reproach. Of reproach? Yes. David strayed a little occasionally, you know, and on one occasion the same direction as Sergeant James Barkley. Remember the small affair of Uriah and Bathsheba? My biblical knowledge is a trifle rusty, I fear, but you will find the same story in the first or second of Samuel. Oh. Okay. I wouldn't have thought about that. Sorry, getting a drink. Oh, Kingler escaped. Oh well. Didn't see it. Anyway. Wait. Did my hair go through my neck? Oh, God, it does. That's weird. Okay. Let's see. What am I doing? Okay. Anyway, on to the second story for the night. The resident patient. In glancing over the somewhat incoherent series of memoirs which I have endeavored to illustrate a few of the mental particularities of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have been struck with the difficulty which I have experienced in picking out examples which shall in every way answer my purpose. For in those cases in which Holmes has performed some tour de force of analytical reasoning and has demonstrated the value of his peculiar methods of investigation, the facts themselves have often been so slight or so commonplace that I could not feel justified in laying them before the public. On the other hand, it has frequently happened that he has been concerned in some research where the facts have been in the most remarkable and dramatic character, but where the share which he has himself taken in determining their causes has been less pronounced than I, as a biographer, could wish. The small matter which I have chronicled under the heading of A Study in Scarlet, and that other later connected with the loss of the Gloria Scott, may serve as examples of the Cilia and Charybdis which are forever threatening his historian. It may be that the business of which I am now about to write the part which my friend played is not sufficiently accentuated, and yet the whole train of circumstances is so remarkable that I cannot bring myself to omit it entirely from the series. It had been a close, rainy day in October. Our blinds were half drawn, and Holmes lay crumpled up on the sofa, reading and rereading a letter which he had received by the morning post. For myself, my term of service in India had trained me to stand heat better than cold, and a thermometer of 90 was no hardship. But the paper was uninteresting. Parliament had risen, everybody was out of town, and I yearned for the glades of the New Forest or the shingle of the South Sea. A depleted bank account had caused me to postpone my holiday, and as to my companion, neither the country nor the sea presented the slightest attraction to him. He loved to lie in the very center of 5 million people, with his filaments stretching out and running through them, responsive to every little rumor or suspicion of unsolved crime. Appreciation of nature found no place among his many gifts, and his only change was when he turned his mind to the evildoer of the town to track down his brother of the country. Finding that Holmes was too absorbed for conversation, I tossed aside the barren paper and, leaning back in my chair, fell into a brown study. Suddenly, my companion's voice broke in upon my thoughts.
"You're right, Watson,"
Said he.
"it does seem a very preposterous way of settling a dispute."
Most preposterous, I exclaimed, and then, suddenly realizing how he had echoed the inmost thought of my soul, I sat up in my chair and stared at him in blank amazement. "What is it, Holmes?" I cried. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." He laughed heartily at my perplexity.
"You remember,"
Said he,
that some little time ago, when I read you a passage of one of Poe's sketches in which a close reader follows the unspoken thoughts of his companion, you are inclined to treat the matter as a tour de force of the author. On my remarking that I was consistently in the habit of doing the same thing, you expressed incredulity.
"Oh, no."
Perhaps not with your tongue, my dear Watson, but certainly with your eyebrows. So when I saw you throw your paper down and enter upon a train of thought, I was very happy to have the opportunity of reading it off, and eventually of breaking into it, as a proof that I had been in a kind of rapport with you.
But I was still far from satisfied. "The example which you read to me," said I, "the reasoner drew his conclusions from the actions of the man whom he observed. If I remember right, he stumbled over a heap of stones, looked up at the stairs, and so on. But I have been seated quietly in my chair. What clues have I given you?"
You do yourself an injustice. The features are given to a man as a means by which he shall express his emotions, and yours are faithful servants.
"Do you mean to say that you read my train of thoughts from my features?"
Your features, and especially your eyes. Perhaps you cannot yourself recall how your reverie commenced.
"No, I cannot."
Then I will tell you. After throwing down your paper, which was the action which drew my attention to you, you sat for half a minute with a vacant expression. Then your eyes fixed themselves upon your newly framed picture of General Gordon, and as I saw the altercation in your face as the train of thought had been started. But it did not lead very far. Your eyes turned across the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, which stands upon the top of your books. Yeah, it isn't. You then glanced up to the wall, and your course was meaning of obvious. You were thinking that if a portrait was framed, it would be able to cover the bare space and correspond to Gordon's picture over there.
"You have followed me wonderfully," I exclaimed.
So far I could hardly have gone astray, but now your thoughts went back to the preacher, and you looked hard across it as if you were studying the character of his features. Then your eyes ceased to pucker, and you continued to look across, and your face was thoughtful. You were recalling the incidents of Beecher's career. I was well aware that you could not do this without thinking of the mission which he undertook on behalf of the North, and at the time of the Civil War, for I remember you expressing your passionate indignation at the way in which he was received by some of the more turbulent of our people. You felt so strongly about it that I knew you could not think of Beecher without thinking of that also. When a moment later I saw your eyes wander away from the picture, I suspected that your mind had somehow turned to the Civil War. And when I observed that your lips set, your eyes sparkled, and your hands clenched, I was positive that you were indeed thinking of the gallantry which was shown by both sides in this desperate struggle. But then, again, your face grew sadder. You shook your head. You were dwelling upon the sadness and horror of the useless waste of life. Your hand stole towards your own old wound, and a smile quivered on your lips, which showed me that the ridiculous side of this method was settling international questions had forced itself upon your mind. At this point, I agreed with you that it was preposterous, and was glad to find that all my deductions had been correct. Oh, yeah.
"Absolutely," said I. "And now that you've explained it, I confess that I am as amazed as before." It was very superficial, my dear Watson, I assure you. I should not have intruded upon your attention had you not shown some incredulity the other day. But the evening has brought a breeze with it. What do you say to ramble through London? I was weary of our little sitting room, and actually acquiesced. For 3 hours we strolled about together, watching the ever-changing kaleidoscope of life as it ebbs and flows through Fleet Street and of the Stand. His characteristic talk, with his keen observations of details and subtle power of inference, held me amused and enthralled. It was 10 o'clock before we reached Baker Street again. A brougham was waiting at the door. A doctor's general practitioner, I believe, said Holmes. Not been long in practice, but has a good deal to do. Come consult to us, I fancy. Lucky we came back. I was sufficiently conversant with Holmes's method to be able to follow his reasoning, and to see that the nature and state of the various medicinal equipment and the wicker baskets which hung from the lamp side of the burrow had given him the data for his swift deduction. The light in our window above showed that this late visit was indeed intended for us. With some curiosity as to what could have been the brother medico to us at such an hour, I followed Holmes into our sanctum. A pale, taper-faced man with sandy whiskers rose up from a chair by the fire as we entered. His age may not have been more than 3 or 4 and 30, but his haggard expression and unhealthy hue told us the life which had sapped his strength and robbed him of his youth. Resident patient. His manner was nervous and shy, like that of a sensitive gentleman, and the thin white hand which he laid upon the mantelpiece as he rose was that of an artist rather than of a surgeon. His dress was quiet and sombre, a black frock coat, dark trousers, and a touch of color about his necktie. Good evening, Doctor, said Holmes cheerily. I am glad to see that you have not been waiting for but only a few minutes. You spoke to my coachman, then? No, it was the candle on the table side that told me. Pray, resume your seat and let me know how I can serve you. My name is Dr. Percy Trevelyan, said our visitor, and I live at 403 Brook Street. Are you not the author of the monograph upon obscure nervous lessons? I asked. His pale cheeks flushed with pleasure at hearing that his work was known to me. I so seldom hear of my work that I thought it was quite dead, said he. My publishers have given me the most discouraging account of its sale. You are, I assume, a medical man? A retired army surgeon. My own hobby has always been nervous disease. I should wish to make it an absolute specialty, but of course a man must take what he can get at first. This, however, is beside the question, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And I am quite appreciate how valuable your time is. The fact is that a very singular train of events has occurred recently at my house at Brook Street, and tonight they came to such a head that I felt it quite impossible for me to wait another hour before asking for your advice and assistance. Sherlock Holmes sat down and lit his pipe. You are very welcome to both, said he. Pray, let me have a detailed account of what circumstances are which have disturbed you. One or two of them are so trivial, said Dr. Trevelyan, that really I'm almost ashamed to mention them. But the matter is so inexplicable, and the recent turn which it has taken is so elaborate that I shall lay it all before you, and shall judge what is essential and what is not. I'm compelled, to begin with, to say something of my own college career. I'm a London University man, and I'm sure that you will not think that I am unduly singing my own praises if I say that my student career was considered by my professors to be a very promising one. After I graduated, I continued to devote myself to research, occupying a manor position at King's College Hospital, and I was fortunate enough to excite considerable attention in my research into the pathology of catalepsy, and finally to win the Bruce Pinkerton Prize and medal for the monographs on nervous lesions, to which your friend has just alluded. I should not go too far if I were to say that there was a general impression at the time that, as a distinguished career lay before me, but one of the great stumbling blocks lay in my want of capital. As you will readily understand, a specialist who aims high is compelled to start in one of the dozen streets of the Cavendish Square quarter, all of which entail enormous rents and furnished expenses. Besides this preliminary outlay, he must be prepared to keep himself for some years, and to hire a presentable carriage and horse. To do this was quite beyond my power, and I could only hope that by the economy I might in 10 years save some enough to enable me to put up my plate. Suddenly, however, an unexpected incident opened up quite a new prospect for me. This was a visit from a gentleman of the name of Blessington, who was a complete stranger to me. He came up into my room one morning and plunged into business in an instant. You are the same Percy Trevelyan who was great, has a distinguished career and won a great prize lately, said he. I bowed. Answer me frankly, he continued, for you will find it in your interest to do so. You have all the cleverness which makes a successful man. Do you have the tact? I could not help smiling at the abruptness of the question. I trust that I have my share, said I. Any bad habits? Not drawn to drink, eh? Really, sir, I cried. Quite right, that's all right. But I am bound to ask, with all these qualities, why are you not in practice? I shrugged my shoulders. Come, come, he said in his bustling way. It's the old story. More in your brains than in your pocket, eh? What would you say if I were to start you in Brook Street? I stared at him in astonishment. Oh, it's for my sake, not for yours, he cried. I'll be perfectly frank with you, and if it suits you, it will suit me very well. I have a few thousand to invest, you see, and I think I'll sink them into you. But why? I gasped. Well, it's just like any other speculation, and safer than most. What am I to do then? I'll tell you. I'll take the house, furnish it, pay the maids, and run the whole place. All you have to do is just to wear out your chair in the consulting room. I'll let you have any pocket money and everything, and then you hand over to me 3/4 of what you earn, and you keep the other quarter for yourself. This was a strange proposal, Mr. Holmes, with which man Blessington approached me. I won't weary you with the account of how we bargained and negotiated. It ended in my moving into the house the next Lady Day, and starting my practice on very much the same conditions as he had suggested. He came himself to live with me in the character of a resident patient. His heart was weak, it appears, and he needed constant medical supervision. He turned the two best rooms of the first floor into a sitting room and a bedroom for himself. He was a man of singular habits, shunning company and very seldom going out. His life was irregular, but in one respect he was regularity itself. Every evening at the same hour he walked into the consulting room, examining the book, put down 5 and 3 pence for every guinea that I had earned, and carried the rest off in the strong box into his own room. I may say with confidence that he never had an occasion to regret his speculations. From the first it was a success. A few good cases and my reputation, which I had won in the hospital, brought me rapidly to the front. And during the last few years I have made him a rich man. So much, Mr. Holmes, for my past history and my relations with Mr. Blessington. It only remains for me now to tell you what has occurred to bring me here tonight. Some weeks ago, Mr. Blessington came down to me, and as he spoke to me, in a state of considerable agitation. He spoke of some burglary which, he said, had been committed in the West End, and he appeared, I remember, to be quite unnecessarily excited about it. Declared that a day should not pass before we should add stronger bolts to our windows and doors. For a week he continued to be in a particular state of restlessness, peering continually out the windows and ceasing to take a short walk which he had usually taken to preclude his dinner. From his manner it struck me that he was in mortal dread of something or somebody. But when I questioned him upon the point, he became so offensive that I was compelled to drop the subject. Gradually, as time passed, his fears appeared to die away, and he renewed his former habits, when a fresh event produced him to a pitiable state of prostration, in which he now lies. What happened was this. 2 days ago I received the letter which I now read to you. Neither address nor date is attached to it. A Russian nobleman who is now resident of England, it runs, would be glad to avail himself to the professional assistance of Dr. Pt10. He has been some years a victim of cataleptic attacks, which, as well known, Dr. Trevelyan is an authority. He proposes to call about 6:15 tomorrow evening, if Dr. Trevelyan will make it convenient to be at home. The letter interested me deeply because chief difficulty in the study of catalepsy is the rareness of the disease. You may believe, then, that I was in my consulting room when the patient, and the appointed hour when the patient occurred. He was an elderly man, thin, demure, and commonplace, by no means the conception one forms of a Russian nobleman. I was much more struck by the appearance of his complexion. He was a tall young man, surprisingly handsome, with a dark, fierce face and the limbs and chest of a Hercules. He had his hand under the other's arm as he entered, and helped him to the chair with a tenderness which was hardly to have been expected from his appearance. "You'll excuse me my coming in, doctor," he said to me, speaking English with a slight lisp. "This is my doctor, and his health is a matter of most overwhelming importance to me." I was touched by his filial anxiety. "You would, perhaps, care to remain during the consultation?" said I. "Not for the world," he cried with a gesture of horror. "It is more painful to me than I can express. If I were to see my father in one of his dreadful seizures, I am convinced that I should never survive it. My own nervous system is an exceptionally sensitive one. With your permission, I will remain in the waiting room while you go into my father's case." To this, of course, I assented, and the young man withdrew. The patient and I then plunged in the discussion of the case, which I took exhaustive notes. He was not remarkable for intelligence, for his answers were frequently obscure, which I attributed to his limited acquaintance with our language. Suddenly, however, as I sat sitting, he ceased to give any answer, and to all my inquiries, and to my turning towards him, I was shocked to see that he was sitting bolt upright in his chair, staring at me with a perfectly blank and rigid face. He was again in the grip of his mysterious malady. My first feeling, as I've just said, was one of pity and horror. My second, I fear, was rather one of professional satisfaction. I made notes of my patient's pulse and temperature, tested the rigidity of his muscles, and examined his reflexes. There was nothing markedly abnormal in any of these conditions, which harmonized with my former experiences. I'd obtained good results in such cases by the annihilation of nitrate in enamel, and the present seemed to be an admirable opportunity of testing its virtues. The bottle was downstairs in my laboratory, so leaving my patient seated in his chair, I ran down to get it. There was some little delay in finding it, 5 minutes, let us say, and then I returned. Imagine my amazement to find an empty room and my patient gone. Of course, my first act was to run into the waiting room. The sun had also gone. The hall door had been closed, but not shut. My page who admits patients is a new boy and by no means quick. He waits downstairs and runs up to show patients out when I ring the consulting room bell. He had heard nothing, and the affair remained a complete mystery. Mr. Blessington came in from his walk shortly afterwards, but I did not say anything to him upon the subject, for, to tell the truth, I have got in the way of late of holding a little communication with him as possible. I never thought that I should see anything more of the Russian and his son, so you can imagine my amazement when, at the very same hour this evening, they both came marching into my consulting room, just as they had done before. I feel that I owe you a great many apologies for my abrupt departure yesterday, Doctor, said my patient. I confess that I was much surprised at it, said I. Well, the fact is, he remarked, that when I recover from these attacks, my mind is always very clouded as to all that has gone before. I woke up in a strange room, as it seemed to me, and made my way out into the street in a sort of dazed way when you were absent. And I, said the son, seeing my father pass the door of the waiting room, naturally thought that the consultation had come to an end. It was not until we had reached home that I began to realize the true state of affairs. Well, said I, laughing, there is no harm done except that you puzzled me terribly. So if you, sir, would kindly step into my waiting room, I shall be happy to continue our consultation, which was brought to so abrupt an ending. For half an hour or so I discussed the old gentleman's symptoms with him, and then, having prescribed for him, I saw him go off upon the arm of his son. I've told you that Mr. Blessington generally chose this hour of the day for his exercise. He came in shortly afterwards and passed upstairs. An instant later I heard him running down, and he burst into my consulting room like a man who was mad with panic. "Who has been in my room?" he cried. "No one," said I. "That's a lie!" he yelled. "Come up and look!" I passed over the grossness of his language, as he seemed half out of his mind with fear. When I went upstairs with him, he pointed to several footprints upon the light carpet. "Do you mean to say those are mine?" he cried. They were certainly very much larger than any which he could have made, and were evidently quite fresh. It rained hard that afternoon, as you know, and my patients were the only people who had called. There must have been one in that case the man in the waiting room had, for some unknown reason, while I was busy with my patient, that he had ascended the room of my resident patient. Nothing had been touched or taken, but there were footprints to prove that the intrusion was undoubtedly fact. Mr. Blessington seemed more excited over the matter than I should have thought possible, though of course it was enough to disturb anyone's peace of mind. He actually sat crying in an armchair, and I could hardly get him to speak coherently. It was his suggestion that I should come around to you, and of course I saw once the propriety of it, for certainly the incident was a very singular one, though he appears to be completely overrated its importance. If you would only come back with me and my broom, you would at least be able to soothe him, though I can hardly hope that you will be able to explain this remarkable occurrence. Sherlock Holmes listened to this long narrative with an intentness which showed me that his interest was keenly aroused. His face was as impassive as ever, but his lids had drooped more heavily over his eyes, and his smoke had curled up more quickly from the pipe to emphasize each curious episode of the doctor's tale. As our visitor concluded, Holmes sprang up without a word, handed me my hat, picked up his own on the table, and followed Dr. Trevelyan to his door. Within a quarter of an hour, we had been dropped at the door of the physician's residence on Brook Street, one of the somber, flat-faced houses which associates with the West End practice. A small page admitted us, and we began at once to ascend the broad, well-carpeted stair. But a singular interruption brought us to a standstill. A light at the top was suddenly whisked out, and from the darkness came a reedy, quivering voice. "I have my pistol," it cried. "I give you my word that I'll fire if you come any nearer."
"This really grows outrageous, Mr. Blessington," cried Dr. Trevelyan.
"Oh, but it is you, Doctor," said the voice with a great heave of relief. "But those other gentlemen, are they what they pretend to be?" We were conscious of a very long scrutiny out of the darkness. "Yes, yes, it's all right," said the voice at last. "You can come up, and I'm sorry my precautions have annoyed you." He relit the stair gas as he spoke, and we saw before us a singular-looking man whose appearance, as well as his voice, testified to his jangled nerves. He was very fat, but had apparently at some time been much fatter, so that the skin hung about his face in loose pouches, like the cheeks of a bloodhound. He was of a sickly color, and his thin, sandy hair seemed to bristle up with the intensity of his emotion. In his hand he held a pistol, but he thrust it into his pocket as we advanced. Good evening, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I'm sure I'm very much obliged to you for coming around, but one never ever needed your advice more than I do. I suppose that Dr. Trevelyan has told you of this most unwarrantable intrusion into my rooms."
"Quite so," said Holmes. "Who are these two men, Mr. Wellington, and why do they wish to molest you?"
Well, said the resident patient in a nervous fashion. "Of course, it is hard to say. You can hardly expect me to answer that, Mr. Holmes."
"Do you mean that you do not know?"
"Come in here, if you please. Just have the kindness to step in here." He led the way into his bedroom, which was large and comfortably furnished. "You see that?" said he, pointing to a big black box at the end of the bed. "I've never been a very rich man, Mr. Holmes. Never made but one investment in my life, as Dr. Trevelyan would tell you. But I don't believe in bankers. I would never trust a banker, Mr. Holmes. Between ourselves, what little I have is in that box. So you can understand what it means to me when unknown people force themselves into my rooms."
Holmes looked at Blessington in his questioning way and shook his head. "I cannot possibly advise you if you try to deceive me," said he.
"But I've told you everything."
Holmes turned his heel with a gesture of disgust. "Good night, Mr. Trevelyan," said he.
No advice for me," cried Blessington in his breaking voice.
"My advice to you, sir, is to speak the truth."
A minute later, we were in the streets walking for home. We had crossed Oxford Street and were halfway down Harley Street before I could get a word from my companion.
"Sorry to bring you out on a fool's errand, Watson," he said at last. "It is an interesting case, too, at the bottom of it."
"I can make little of it," I confessed.
"Well, it is quite evident that there were two men, more perhaps, but at least two, who were determined for some reason to get this fellow Blessington. I have no doubt in my mind that both on the first and the second occasion the young man penetrated into Mr. Blessing's room, while his confederate, by an ingenious device, kept the doctor from interfering. The catalepsy? A fraudulent imitation, Watson. Though I should hardly dare to hint as much to our specialist. It is a very easy complaint to imitate. I have done it myself. And then, by the purest chance, Blissington was out on each occasion. The reason for choosing so unusual an hour for the consultation was obvious to ensure that there would be no one other patient in the waiting room. But just as so happened, however, that this hour coincided with Blissington's constitutional, which seems to show that they were not very well acquainted with his daily routine. Of course, if they had been merely after plunder, they would have at least made some attempt to search for it. Besides, I can read in a man's eyes when it is his own skin that he is frightened for. It is inconceivable that this fellow could have made up two such vindictive enemies as these appear to be without knowing it. I hold it, therefore, to be certain that he does know who these men are, and that for reasons of his own he represses it. It is just possible that tomorrow may find him in a more communicative mood. Is there not one alternative? I suggested. Grotesquely improbable, no doubt, but still just conceivable. Might the whole story be a cataleptic Russian in a son be the concoction of Dr. Trillins, who has, for his own purposes, been in Blessington's room? My dear fellows, said he, it was one of the first solutions which occurred to me, but I was soon able to corroborate the doctor's tale. This young man had left prints upon the stair carpet, which made it quite superfluous for me to ask to see those which he had just made in the room. When I tell you that his shoes were square-toed instead of being pointed like Blessington's, and were quite an inch and a third longer than the doctor's, you will acknowledge that there can be no doubts to his individuality. But we may sleep on it now, for I shall be surprised if we do not hear something further from Brook Street in the morning. Sherlock Holmes's prophecy was soon fulfilled, in a dramatic fashion. At 7:30 next morning, in the first dim glimmer of daylight, I found him standing by my bedside in his dressing gown. "There's a brougham waiting for us, Watson," said he. "What's the matter, then?" "The Brook Street business." "Any fresh news?" "Tragic, but ambiguous," said he, pulling up the blind. "Look at this, a sheet from a notebook, with 'For God's sake, come at once, Pt.' scrawled upon it in pencil. Our friend the doctor was hard put to it when he wrote this. Come along, my dear fellow, for it's an urgent call. In a quarter of an hour we were back at the physician's house. He came running out to meet us and face in horror. "Oh, such a business!" he cried, with his hands to his temples. "What then?" "Blessington has committed suicide." Holmes whistled. "Yes, he hanged himself during the night." We had entered, and the doctor had preceded us into what was evidently his waiting room. "I really hardly know what I'm doing," he cried. "The police are already upstairs. It has shaken me most dreadfully." "When did you find it out?" "He has a cup of tea taken to him in the early every morning. When the maid entered about 7, there's an unfortunate fellow was hanging in the middle of his room. He had tied his cord to the hook of a very heavy lamp used to hang, and he had jumped off the top of the very box he had showed us yesterday." Holmes stood for a moment in deep thought. "With your permission," he said at last, "I should like to go upstairs and look into the matter." We both ascended, followed by the doctor. It was a dreadful sight which met us when we entered the bedroom door. I have spoken of the impression of
a flabbiness which the man Lessington had conveyed. He was dangling from a hook. It was exaggerated and intensified until he was scarce human by his appearance. The neck was drawn out like a plucked chicken's, making the rest of him seem more the obese and unnatural by contrast. He was clad only in his long night dress, and his swollen ankles and ungainly feet protruded starkly from beneath it. Beside him stood the smart-looking police inspector, who was taking notes in the pocketbook. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he said heartily as my friend entered. "I'm delighted to see you." "Good morning, Lena," answered Holmes. "You won't think me an intruder, I'm sure. Have you heard of the events which led up to this affair?" "Yes, I heard something of them." "Have you formed an opinion?" "Well, as far as I can see, the man is driven out of his senses by fright. The bed has been slept in, you see. There's an impression deep enough. It's about 5 in the morning, you know. That suicides are most common. That would have been about the time he hanged himself. It seems to be a very deliberate affair." "I should say that he's been dead for 3 hours, judging by the rigidity of his muscles," said I. "Notice anything peculiar about the room?" said Holmes. "Found a screwdriver and some screws in a washhand stand. Seems to have smoked heavily during the night, too. There are 4 cigar ends, but I picked that out of the fireplace." Said Holmes. "Have you got a cigar holder?" "No, I've seen none." "A cigar case, then?" "Yes, it was in his coat pocket." Holmes opened it and smelled a single cigar which it contained. "Oh, this is a Havana. And these others are cigars of a particular sort which is imported from the Dutch from the East Indian colonies. They are usually wrapped in straw, you know, and they are thinner for their length than any other brand." He picked up 4 ends and examined them with his pocket lens. "2 of these have been smoked by a holder, and 2 without," said he. "2 have been cut, but not a very sharp knife, and 2 have had the ends bitten off by a most excellent set of teeth. This was no suicide, Miss Helena. It was very deeply planned and cold-blooded murder." "Possible!" cried the inspector. "And why?" "Why should anyone murder a man in so clumsy a fashion as by hanging him?" "That is what we have to find out." "How could they get in?" "Through the front door." "It was barred in the morning." "Then it was barred after them." "How do you know?" "I saw their traces. Excuse me a moment, and I may be able to give you some further information about it." He went over to the door, and turning the lock, he examined it in his methodical way. Then he took out the key, which was on the inside, and inspected that also. The bed, the carpet, the chairs, the mantelpiece, and the dead body, and the rope were each in turn examined, until at last he professed himself satisfied. And with my aid and that of the inspector, cut down the wretched object and laid it reverently under a sheet. "How about this rope?" he asked. "This is cut off," said Dr. Trellan, drawing a large coil from under the bed. He was morbidly nervous of fire. He always kept this beside him, so that he might escape by the window in case the stairs were burning. "That must have saved the trouble," said Holmes thoughtfully. "Yes, the actual facts are very plain, and I shall be surprised if by this afternoon I cannot give you the reasons for them. I will take this photograph of Blessington, which I see upon the mantelpiece, as I may help me in my inquiries." "But you have told us nothing!" cried the doctor. "Oh, there can be no doubt as to the sequence of events," said Holmes. "There were 3 of them in it: the young man, an old man, and a third to whose identity I have no clue.
The first two, I need hardly remark, are the same as who masquerade as a Russian count and his son. So we can give a very full description of them. They were admitted by a Confederate inside the house. If I might offer you a word of advice, Inspector, it would be to not only arrest the page, who, as I understand, has only recently come into your service, Doctor. The young imp cannot be found, said Dr. Trillin. The maid and the cook have just been searching for him. Holmes shrugged his shoulders. He has not played an unimportant part in this drama, said he. Three men having ascended the stairs, which they did on tiptoe, the older man first, the younger man second, and the unknown man in the rear. My dear Holmes, I ejaculated. Oh, there can be no question as to the position of the footmarks. I had the advantage of learning which was which last night. They ascended, then, to Mr. Blissington's room, the door of which they found to be locked. With the help of a wire, however, they forced around the key. Even without the lens, you will perceive by the scratches on this board where the pressure was applied. On entering the room, their first proceeding must have been to gag Mr. Blissington. He may have been asleep, or he may have been so paralyzed in terror as to have not been able to cry out. These walls were thick, and it is conceivable that a shriek, if he had time to utter one, was unheard. Having secured him, it is evident to me that consultation of some sort was held, probably of something of the nature of judicial proceeding. It must have been last time for some time, for it was that these cigars had been smoked. The older man sat in the wicker chair. It was he who used the cigar holder. The younger man sat over yonder. He knocked his ash against the chest of the drawers. The third fellow paced up and down. Blessington, I think, sat upright in the chair, in bed, but of that I cannot be absolutely certain. Well, it ended by their taking Blessington and hanging him. The matter was so prearranged that it was my own belief that they had brought with them some sort of block or pulley which might have served as a gallows. That screwdriver and those screws were, as I conceive, for fixing it up. Seeing the hook, however, they naturally saved themselves the trouble. Having finished their work, they made off, and the door was barred behind them by their confederate. We had all listened to the deepest interest to the sketch of the night's doings, which Holmes had deduced from signs so subtle and minute that even when he had pointed them out to us, we could scarcely follow him in his reasonings. The inspector hurried away on the instant to make inquiries about the page, while Holmes and I returned to Baker Street for breakfast. I'll be back by 3, said he, when he had finished his meal. Both the inspector and the doctor will meet me here at an hour, and I hope by that time to have cleared up any obscurity which the case may still have present. Our visitors arrived at the appointed time, but it was 3:15 before my friend put in an appearance. His expression as he entered, however, I could see that all had gone well with him. Any news, Inspector? We've got the boy, sir. Excellent, and I've got the men. You got them, we all cried. Well, I at least got their identity. The so-called Blessington, as I expected, well known at the headquarters, and so are his assailants. Their names are Biddle, Hayward, and Moffat. The Worthington Bank gang, cried the inspector. Precisely, said Holmes. Then Blessington must have been Sutton. Exactly, said Holmes. Why, that makes it as clear as crystal, said the inspector. But Trevelyan and I looked at each other bewildered. You must surely remember the great Worthington Bank business, said Holmes. 5 men were in it. These 4, and a fifth called Cartwright. Tobin, the caretaker, was murdered, and the thieves got away with £7,000. This was in 1875. They were all 5 arrested, but the evidence against them was by no means conclusive. This Blessington, or Sutton, who was the worst of the gang, turned informer. On his evidence, Cartwright was hanged, and the other 3 got 15 years apiece. When they got out the other day, which was some years before their full term, they set themselves, as you perceive, to hunt down the traitor and to avenge the death of their comrade upon him. Twice they tried to get at him and failed. The third time, you see, it came off. Is there anything further which I can explain, Dr. Trevelyan? I think you have made it remarkably clear, said the doctor. No doubt the day on which he was so perturbed in the day is when he had seen that they released in the newspapers. Quite so. His talk about the burglary was the merest blind. But why could he not tell you this? Well, my dear, knowing the vindictive character of his old associates, he was trying to hide his own identity from everyone as long as he could. His secret was a shameful one, and he could not bring himself to divulge it. However, wretch as he was still living under the shield of the British law. And I have no doubt, Inspector, that you will see that, through the shield that may fall to guard, the sword of justice is still there to avenge. Such were the singular circumstances in connection to the resident patient and to the Brook Street doctor. From that night, nothing has been seen of the three murderers by the police, and it is surmised at Scotland Yard that they were among the passengers of an ill-fated steamer, Noah Carina, which was lost some years ago, with all hands aboard on the Portuguese coast, some leagues to the north of Porto. Proceedings against the page broke down for want of evidence, and the Brook Street mystery, as it is called, has never again been put down, dealt with in any public print. Okay, now I want to try to do the third one. Greek interpreter. It is 21 pages. I haven't hit the 2-hour mark yet. Much shorter than the resident patient was. Longer than the crooked man. Hmm. I don't know. Let me go and end it here for tonight. The last three look like they're a lot longer stories, so I'll go ahead and save them for a little bit longer. Of course, I have to figure out what I'm going to do after I finish the Sherlock Holmes novel. Let's see. Who is on that is readable? Why is it showing me welcome to the chat room? Oh, never. That's just weird. It was cool last week because when I finished reading Sherlock Holmes, I actually rated someone who was playing the Sherlock Holmes game. And suffice to say, they weren't very good at it. I would like to get it, but I think I've put the Sherlock Holmes game on my Steam wish list because, oh, do I have it on? Now I've got it on my Xbox wish list. But yeah, it was interesting that I was able to find someone doing Sherlock Holmes. But as I said, were they were struggling. Let's see. Don't see anyone on my follow that's playing it tonight, though. What is Melissa doing? Why did you say special events? No. She's doing a streamathon, but she's doing it for stuff. Let's see. Oh, Matsu, do you have any suggestions on who to raid? Hmm. That's strange. I don't see any of the other readers that I follow online either. Let's do it. Which is oh, they're doing Pokemon. Hmm. Faust is doing art. So it's doing. Yeah, a lot of people doing art right now. Man. Hmm. What's Ren doing? Uh, Come on, load the stream. Huh. I don't know. I can't think of anyone to raid. I really want to do a raid because it's kind of like the married Issa. I haven't gone into her streams for a while. She's only been on about 20 minutes. That should be fine. She's doing music, so not bad. So let me. Oh, hold on. Oops, so I type everything right. I've got my follower alert. My subscriber one. It's a should be real easy to buy the emote. I think it's only 100. But I'm going to raid Issa. She's a very talented singer and one of the earlier ones I started following. So be kind of cool to raid her. So let's go listen to her. So get that raid started. If we'll start. Why is the raid not going? Am I just missing something here? The heck? Did I type it right? No, it's just ISAA. Huh. Oh, it says her settings won't let me read. Well, fine then. I'll read Dusk instead. Who was the one who made my chibi model. And pretty good friend, so. I will see everyone over in her stream. Do go back to Fairy Tales tomorrow, so. Have a good night, evening, afternoon, whichever it may be. This time zone. Get some rest otherwise. And I will see you hopefully tomorrow. Bye.